Welcome back to Face the Nation. Last week, another 3 million Americans filed for unemployment. Retail sales and factory output recorded record declines, signs of the economic damage from coronavirus. Tonight on 60 Minutes, Scott Pelley talks with the most powerful man in the finance world, Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell. Here's a preview.
What economic reality do the American people need to be prepared for?
Well, I would take a more optimistic cut at that if I could, and that is, this is a time of great suffering and difficulty, and it's come on us so quickly and with such force that you really can't put into words the pain people are feeling and the uncertainty they're realizing. And it's going to take a while for us to get back, but I would just say this, in the long run, and even in the medium run, you wouldn't want to bet against the American economy. This economy will recover. It may take a while. It may take a period of time. It could stretch through the end of next year. We really don't know.
Can there be a recovery without a reasonably effective vaccine?
Assuming there's not a second wave of the coronavirus, I think you'll see the economy recover steadily through the second half of this year. For the economy to fully recover, people will have to be fully confident, and that may have to await the arrival of a vaccine.
Scott's full interview with the Fed chairman airs tonight on 60 Minutes. We go now to Gary Cohn. He's the former director of the National Economic Council under President Trump. He joins us from Long Island, New York. Good morning.
Good morning, Margaret.
You just heard the Federal Reserve chairman say no full recovery until there is a vaccine. Is the logical extension of that there will be widespread unemployment well into next year?
So first of all, I thought Chairman Powell did a very good job of summarizing the economic situation with some optimism and saying, look, if we don't get a second outbreak in the fall, which is just predicted, we don't know if that will happen or not, that we will continue to grow our economy, and our economy will continue to have a natural recovery. So, and he was quite optimistic, and I am quite optimistic. The U.S. economy is quite resilient. And I have to remind people that we ended up in this economic situation by necessity. We made a conscientious decision to shut down our economy and have everyone stay home to flatten the curve, which was the right decision. But we created this economic situation. We can unwind this much more quickly than some of the comparisons that we're making in time, where there were situations where our unemployment data happened over a long period of time because of declining employment and declining sales.
But the counter to that is there are people in immediate and severe pain now. I mean, the Fed revealed this week that 40% of people making under $40,000 a year lost their jobs in just 1 month in March. I mean, we're hearing about food insecurity. The Fed chair pointed to Congress, and you just heard the Speaker of the House say time is of the essence. Do you agree with her that more emergency aid needs to happen now, or can you wait, as Republicans want to do?
So I think I agree with 50% of what the Speaker was saying. So part of the HEROES Act was to get money, or is to get money, to the states, to the state and local government. And I do think that is very important. The state and local governments have been hard hit. The last thing we want to see is state and local governments in our time of need having to lay off firemen, policemen, teachers, first responders, frontline people that we're relying upon for our everyday life. That would be the complete wrong outcome here. So the federal government does have to step in and help out states. Just like they've helped small businesses and big businesses, they should help the states. That doesn't mean they should return the states to perfect financial condition. On the other half of the bill, and you didn't ask me about that, there are some things in there that are much more aimed at a recovery than the current position we're in. In addition to that, if we really want to get the people back to work that Chairman Powell was talking about, we need to reopen the economy. Those people earning less than $40,000 a year are very important, and we rely on them. But think about the healthcare system. The healthcare system is 20% of our GDP. If we get our healthcare system back up and running, a lot of people in the lower wage bracket end up working in the healthcare system. We need that to happen. If we get people going back to work, Think of what it means to go back to work. You get in
Sure,
your car, you
but
drive,
it's
you
not
go to the
neither
gas
or,
station.
it's not neither or, it's a how, right? And part of what Congress would be doing is figuring that out policy-wise. The administration is floating the idea of a payroll tax cut, slashing the corporate tax rate, suspending capital gains on assets bought between now and the end of the year. How does any of that help the people who are in pain now?
Well, look, Margaret, we have to decide where we are. Are we responding to the crisis, or are we trying to stimulate a recovery? And look, this is a very difficult situation because the federal government sits on top, and then each state is going to decide what we're doing. If we're trying to respond to the crisis, we're right, and this is where I agree with the speaker. We have to get the states money to help them respond to the crisis. If we're trying to stimulate economic growth, which would be the second half of the equation, we would use a different set of tools to stimulate economic growth. And we have a huge toolbox of tools we can use to stimulate economic growth.
But those specific proposals, payroll tax cuts, lowering the corporate interest rate, does that do any of what you're talking about?
Well, look, payroll tax cuts puts money in the pockets of people who are working.
Right.
Right now, we're talking about the unemployed people.
Exactly.
Payroll tax cut doesn't help an unemployed person, so I'm not in favor of a payroll tax cut.
So what are you saying? Are you saying more direct
back to work?
Okay, but are you also saying more direct aid to people? Because one of the questions around extending unemployment benefits as they are now is this unintended consequence of people actually sometimes making more on unemployment than if they take the option to go back to the employer that maybe furloughed them. So what's the solution there?
So, Margaret, look, I think you just hit on a very important concept. When we first started the enhanced unemployment benefits, we did it for a specific purpose. We wanted to, and we needed to get people out of the economy. We needed them to stay home. So we changed the definition of unemployment. We said, look, stay home. Don't look for a job. We don't want you to leave your house. Now I think we have to go back to the more traditional definition of unemployment. If you're unemployed, you get benefits. But if you need to be looking for a job, and if you get offered a job, you should have to take that job and you should come off of unemployment benefits. We need to transition out of the extraordinary measures that were justifiable 60 days ago, 90 days ago, into the real world of what is the continuous definition of unemployment.
Two things. Do you think equity markets are behaving rationally? And are you accepting the idea that the tax cuts that you personally helped usher through for the Trump administration may have to disappear, as so many on Wall Street are predicting, to pay for all of this?
First of all, I have said it and I'll say it again. We now understand that we have to be in positions of federal government to spend $2 to $5 trillion at a moment's notice to support our infrastructure and support our economy. That said, we need to sit down and look at both sides of the equation. We need to sit down and look at the revenue side of the equation, and we need to look at the expense side of the equation. So I would say, yes, that the tax situation in the United States has to be readjusted. Everything should be on the table. But remember, the expense side of the equation, everything should be on the table as well. As far as the stock market goes, remember the stock market.
So your tax cuts, you mean, you accept, would likely have to go away.
So I think everything is on the table. And remember, Margaret, I think the tax cuts are completely misconstrued. We gave big tax breaks to lower income earners, and we taxed higher income earners. And in fact, in the HEROES bill, you'll see they're trying to roll back the SALT deduction. The SALT deduction was a way that we taxed most of the higher earners. Only the top 30% of earners really use the SALT deduction. They're the ones that own the big homes and pay the big real estate taxes and pay big state income taxes, then they're using that deduction. Rolling that deduction back does not make sense right now when the federal government needs money in this environment. On the stock market, look, the stock market is very forward-looking, and I think the stock market, like Chairman Powell, is fairly optimistic of where we're going to get to, and there is a path forward. And I will remind people, it's made up of the largest companies in America, and a lot of those companies have actually become more essential to our daily lives today, not less essential. If there were an index of small local businesses, I think that index would be trading at depressed values.
Gary Cohn, thank you for joining us. We have to leave it there. We'll be back.
Margaret?
We're back with former FDA Commissioner Dr. Scott Gottlieb, who joins us from Westport, Connecticut. Good morning.
Good morning.
You heard Secretary Azar say hundreds of millions of people, 300 million doses of a vaccine by January. Is that realistic?
Well, first, we have to remember that the doses probably, we have to cut it in half because many of these vaccines, and Sanofi has already spoken to this, you're going to probably need 2 doses of the vaccine. So whatever supply we have is probably sufficient to actually dose and inoculate about half the number of people. I think our expectation should be that we're going to have millions of doses of vaccine available in the fall to do large phase 3 clinical trials, maybe low tens of millions of doses if multiple manufacturers make it through phase 1, phase 2 studies. And we might make them available under an emergency use authorization if we do have outbreaks or an epidemic in the fall for certain high-risk groups. Another thing to consider is that these vaccines may not be completely protective. What they may do is prevent you from getting COVID, the disease, and from getting severe pneumonia, but you may still get the infection. So you may still be able to get and transmit the infection, but you just won't get as sick. And that may be how these vaccines ultimately are used. And so what you might do in that situation, if we do have an epidemic, is use the vaccines on people who are really at high risk of a bad outcome, like people maybe in a nursing home. But I think our base assumption should be that we'll have millions of vaccines, maybe low tens of millions of vaccines, if multiple manufacturers are successful in those early studies.
So 328 million Americans, 8 billion people in the world, they're going to want this overnight. What you're saying is that's not happening by January, period.
Well, remember, it takes a while to manufacture vaccine, and then once you manufacture it, you have to do stability testing. So you don't just manufacture vaccine and roll it off the line and then send it out into the public to have people inoculated with it. You're going to hold it, you do stability testing, so you make sure the vaccine is appropriate for use. In 2009 with H1N1, when we went to make that vaccine, so we had the vaccine construct, it worked well in the laboratory and in small-scale studies. When we went to scale up the manufacturing, we found we weren't getting good yield with it, and we actually lost about 2 months in that process of trying to make that vaccine in time for the fall. So a lot of things, there's a lot of uncertainties as you go from vaccines that you're manufacturing on a smaller scale in an experimental fashion in early stage studies when you try to scale up and get volume. So a lot of things can go wrong. A lot of things can be delayed. It's very hard to get to the point where you're manufacturing at high quantities. I would say that's probably more likely a 2021 event that we're going to have the vaccine available in sufficient quantities to mass inoculate the population. And remember, there might be 200 million people who want this vaccine, who are eligible for it. That might take 400 million doses. And so it's probably a 2021 event. I do think we'll have the vaccine available in the fall for use, maybe to ring fence an outbreak if you have an outbreak in a large city, or to inoculate a certain portion of the population on an experimental basis to protect them because they're at high risk of a bad outcome.
We're learning more about this virus, including the potential risk to children. What would you tell parents who are concerned about these reports out of Italy, the UK, and now the US that young children are being affected?
Look, the reports are deeply concerning. There appears to be some kind of post-viral syndrome associated with this virus. The WHO and the CDC have now stepped forward and said they've associated with this virus, although it's not definitive, the causal relationship. It appears to be some kind of post-viral immune type phenomena. We see this in other kinds of viruses. What we don't know is the denominator. We don't know how many kids have actually had the virus. Is it hundreds of thousands or millions of children that have had the virus and we're seeing, maybe 100 or 200 of these cases? Or if only thousands of kids had the virus and we're seeing hundreds of cases, that would be deeply concerning if the incidence was that high. This was first detected by the British April 26th. The Italians have reported on a cluster. And the New York City doctors and health officials were the first to report on a cluster here in the United States. They've now reported on more than 100 of these cases and 3 tragic deaths. But again, we don't know that denominator of how many kids are getting infected. There was a study in Science magazine about 2 weeks ago that said that children are probably a third as likely to get infected with coronavirus as adults. So that means that kids are getting infected, but probably at a much lower rate than adults, but they're still getting infected. And if you figure maybe upwards of 20 million people in the U.S. have had the infection at this point, and that's possible, that means a lot of kids might have had it as well.
Well, I know the CDC did put out some guidance on that this week, saying call your pediatrician if your kid has any of the rashes like we just showed you on the screen. But on the issue of the CDC, you said before on this program the CDC needs to be sharing more information than they are in terms of what doctors are seeing and learning. There need to be more specific guidelines for businesses and schools. You heard a White House advisor say the CDC failed the country on testing this morning. Alex Azar disagreed with that, the Health and Human Services Secretary. How do you assess what is happening at the CDC right now?
Well, I disagree with that assessment as well about the diagnostic test. Even if the CDC had rolled out that test perfectly, there still wouldn't have been enough testing in place in the nation to do what we call sentinel surveillance to try to detect this virus earlier. What needed to happen was someone needed to pick up the phone and call the CEOs of LabCorp and Quest and the other big labs, probably sometime in January or at least in early February.
Who
and
would
get
that
them
person
spun
have
up.
been? The
'Cause they're
Health
the
and
only ones
Human
with the-
Services Secretary or the FDA Commissioner?
It would have been one of those two. It would have been someone within HHS to ask them to spin up tests. And if they had asked the CEOs to do that, I'm willing to bet that they would have done it, and you would have gotten the big labs in the game. That's what needed to happen. As far as CDC is concerned, I mean, I think the part of the agency where I think there could be more information is trying to catalog the collected clinical experience. We've now had more than 1 million people infected with this in the United States, probably tens of millions of people infected. We've had hundreds of thousands of hospitalizations, 90,000 deaths. We haven't seen a really definitive, systematic accounting of the collected clinical experience with those patients and their outcomes and what interventions were used on them. This is what CDC does, puts out this information in the setting of public health emergency so it can inform what we're doing. We're learning a lot of this by word of mouth with physicians, even on Twitter, that people have coagulopathy, so their blood's clotting. We're learning that maybe you shouldn't be ventilating patients on respirators as aggressively as we were. We're learning that many patients are getting blood clots to their lungs, and that's what may be causing some of the rapid decompensation. Now we're learning about this pediatric syndrome. So we're learning a lot that should be coming from the CDC. I think that's where we can be doing much more, putting out this information. And the guidelines are a separate matter.
Okay.
I think the more that CDC puts out very detailed guidelines, the better businesses can restart.
All of us want more facts. Thank you, Dr. Gottlieb. Appreciate it. We'll be
Thanks a
back
lot.
in a moment. Among the many disturbing pictures that we've become accustomed to seeing since the pandemic started are those of people seeking help feeding their families. The lines at food banks have been shocking. The numbers are too. In April, more than 1 in 5 U.S. households reported not having sufficient resources to buy food. That number increased to 2 in 5 households, 41% for mothers with children 12 and under. We go now to Dallas and Claire Babineaux-Fontenot. She is the CEO of Feeding America, the nation's largest hunger relief organization. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
We've heard the statistics in terms of who is most vulnerable and how hard they are getting hit. We also know that food prices had their biggest spike in decades just last month. This seems like the perfect storm. What are you seeing at your facilities right now? Who is coming and what do they need?
Well, Margaret, I think you used the right term. It is, in fact, the perfect storm. We're seeing a marked increase in demand to the tune of, on average, 60% more people showing up in need of our services. And at the time that we're having that increase in demand, we have a decrease in donations, we have an increase in cost of food, and we have a decrease in volunteers. So it is, in fact, a perfect storm. So many of the people who are coming, oh, I'm so sorry.
Yes,
please
no, please. So how are you managing that? And is the person that you are serving now, as challenging as it is, different from what you saw just a few months ago? Is it a different demographic?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say, that 40% on average of the people that we're seeing now have never relied upon the charitable food system before now. So we're definitely seeing different people showing up. So many of the people who are there, they're kind of familiar to us. Some of the people who were donors are now in line in need of our services. So there's been a change, to be sure. But one of the things that I think the American public simply wasn't aware of is that even before this pandemic, there were nearly 40 million people who were food insecure, and over 11 million of them were children. So we've had a challenge for a while. This pandemic has just heightened that challenge, and a lot of people are in need of help right now.
I know things like diapers aren't covered by food stamps. Are items like that what you need at your facilities? What are you looking for right now to serve, in particular, those children?
Well, we need a whole host of things. First and foremost, we need food. So what we have done is we've had a remarkable outpouring of support from across the country in terms of dollars so that we can purchase food. We've also had some assistance from the Congress and some of the legislations that's already been passed, some help from the administration in the form of deregulation so that we're able to provide that food in a new way. But there continues to be a need. I don't know that I mentioned that so far the members of our network, just since March, have provided over 1 billion meals to people facing hunger. But our estimates are that over the course of the next 12 months, that the need just inside of our system is over 8 billion. So big need and across all of those indices that you just described, absolutely.
Brookings said 1 in 5 American children are going hungry. I know you just told us about the pain you're seeing, particularly with kids. 41% of mothers with children ages 12 and under report food insecurity. What is it? I read that you need food and items from manufacturers, not necessarily
Yes.
from individuals. Explain what's changed. What do you mean by that?
Well, I don't know that I would limit it just to manufacturers. So maybe the best thing for me to do is to start from the top and say what the hierarchy are of things that we think are absolutely essential right now. You mentioned SNAP just a few moments ago.
Food stamps.
Truly, SNAP is formerly known as food stamps. Thank you for that. For every 1 meal that we're able to provide in the charitable food system, SNAP can provide 9. And one of the interesting things about SNAP is not only is it good for people right now in the middle of a pandemic and an emergency, but it's also good for the economy. We have data that shows that for every $1 invested in SNAP, the return is $1.70. So there are lots of good reasons for all of us to be thinking about and urging our members of Congress to pass additional legislation so that we can increase access to SNAP, and so that we can increase the thresholds in terms of how much people can receive from SNAP. So that's first and foremost. Secondly, as I mentioned before, we're doing, by the way, may I take the opportunity to just acknowledge the remarkable people in this network and in other nonprofits as well, who are really stepping up to this challenge and providing these services to people when they need it. But the gap hasn't closed. We did some analysis that showed over a 6-month window, our analysis showed that in our network alone, that the gap was about $1.4 billion.
So this $3 billion
assumed
that the USDA is doing in terms of taking food from farmers and bringing it to banks, that's not solving the issue.
Well, it's helping, and we hope it will help. It's early days, and we're going to do everything in our power to make that program successful.
Okay.
Because an additional $3 billion in food would certainly be helpful right now. But the gap still won't be closed, even with that effort. So my encouragement to your audience and to members of Congress and the administration and people all across the country is let's just keep trying to help,
Yes.
and we can close this gap together.
We agree with you. Thank you so much. We'll be right back. That's it for today. Thank you for watching. For Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.